Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the Phillips Manor Hall History Lecture Series, sponsored by the Friends of Phillips Manor Hall and Tompkins Bank. We're coming to you live from Phillips Manor Hall and remote from Brooklyn. Yes, Moody? Um,
Yep,
so
from Brooklyn, New York.
Yeah, we're very pleased today to have Ben Moody Harney. Moody is the founder of Real Mother Shuckers, the only oyster cart in Brooklyn. Fascinated by the story of Thomas Downing, the oyster king of New York, the son of free slaves who peddled oysters on Wall Street in the late 1800s and went on to open one of the most successful oyster restaurants of his time. Moody envisioned operating his own oyster cart and made that a reality. He believes the oyster can regain its place as an everyman's food. So tonight, he will be talking about the history of oysters in New York from the deep history all the way up to the 19th century and the present. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Moody. Thanks so much again for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to the talk.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be able to be heard about all of this stuff. It's kind of some weird context and something that most people don't get to really talk about or get to hear about. So I'm really always happy to be able to talk about what I've been learning and discuss it with people who are interested. So thanks for having me. So yeah, definitely. I want to start off with thanking everybody for coming here, and then we'll get directly into what my PowerPoint is today. It's the world as an oyster, so it's a little bit about the oyster an as an organism or as an animal, the impact that it's had on our planet, and the impact that it can have potentially in the future in terms of making a better planet for everybody, and the importance that it really should play inside of our day-to-day eating and living that we don't really think about very much because it's been kind of reserved as like this fancy food or fine dining food as opposed to being the common person's food, which is what it's really designed to be. So this is my first slide, the world as an oyster. And this is what we're going to learn about today. So the existence of oysters on the planet, oysters in early humans, oysters in the foundation of New York City, the black man with the oyster plan, factories killed the oyster star, the Clean Water Act, a brand new plan, and oysters of the future. All right. So we can get right into the first slide. Now, as we get into this one, I want to say this is not my personal opinions about stuff. This is just what is accepted as science in terms of like what people teach as science. And so, I just want to start off with that. So basically, in terms of what science says, the planet, our universe started out and everything was pretty much just kind of chaotic. It was a lot of different bodies kind of colliding into each other and, kind of just molten lava and gases on the surface of these bodies. And there wasn't really any organic life that had been formed yet. It was pretty much just fire, and eventually, as the planet started to get these electrical storms, fire and ice, and the ice started to create what we would know as being oceans. And the oceans that we come to know today really didn't have the same kind of look or ability to have the body that they have now, because, like I said, there was no organic life on the planet. So it was really just kind of oxidizing the rocks, oxidizing those raw minerals that had been cooled, and creating something that we know of as rust. And the rust began our first soil, which was actually clay. And, so from the clay, that was the original soil that we had on this planet specifically, but really probably any planet. And that was the beginnings of the planet that we know of today. Next slide. So after the ocean started to form, and we got, kind of those oxidized places where we had these like beaches of clay, we got to get something called cyanic bacteria. So the cyanic bacteria is something that we know of as green algae today. And green algae was a very interesting animal. It was a bacteria, but it was like the first animal that we had on our planet. And that bacteria or animal can actually photosynthesize light. So, based off of the photosynthesis of light, our planet turned green for the first time because of this green algae or cyanic bacteria. So, on the water, we had cyanic bacteria, and on the land, we had a mycelium. And these things were kind of forming the carbon that would create the oxygen or create the atmosphere that would kind of create the place that life could inhabit on this planet, creating our first like greenhouse effect. And the things that started to form after that were things that would actually be eating this cyanic bacteria. And that was kind of the very beginning of there being organic matter being added to the waters that we had here and the land that we had here, the cyanic bacteria for the oceans. So this is some examples of the early animals that we would have had on this planet. And as you can see here, our first animals that we had looked more like plants and behaved a little bit more like plants than animals that we're familiar with. They would have been filter feeder animals, and oysters are filter feeder animals as well. Another example of a filter feeder animal would be like coral. And as we know to this day, oysters are asymmetrical animals, so they're very, very primitive inside of their structure in terms of the shape that they have. Majority of animals, even the ones that you see here, they are not asymmetrical, so they have like a definitive center point, a definitive line in the middle, kind of folded up in the middle, and they'll be the same on both sides. That's kind of something we're more familiar with in terms of plants and animals. These animals were very much so kind of free form in order to be able to filter feed at the maximum capacity. And so that's just kind of some evidence of like how prehistoric that oysters are and coral are, but also how integral that they are to our planet. So in the very beginning, there would have been basically these oyster reefs all across the planet, and there would have been coral reef inside of the tropical zones. And that's still something that would exist to this day in terms of being able to create the ocean floor or the backbone of our ocean and create basically the habitat for majority of the life that's inside the sea that we're familiar with. It all would basically start off at these areas where the carbon's being reduced by the ingestion of these the filter feeders and creating an oxygen-rich environment for life to be able to kind of procreate and the structure of these asymmetrical creatures giving lots of nooks and crannies besides the fresh oxidized water to be able to create habitat for nursery for a lot of the smaller fish and for basically all of the seafloor, all the sea life that we know of today. Everything from sponges and things of that nature to seaweed, they would all be relying on these very oxygenated environments to be able to thrive and do well. So a bad joke that I hear very often is that the first person to eat an oyster must have been really hungry. And I get it. It's like oysters are not necessarily, they look kind of like a rock, right? They're not necessarily something that you would look at and be like, ooh, I want to eat that just looking at them. And then also inside of the body of an oyster, something that's kind of intimidating for a lot of people is the texture of the oyster. It's very delicate. And so somebody who's, not familiar with eating oysters, that would be something that's kind of off-putting at first, just due to the fact that they're not something that looks like the things that we normally eat. You know, they don't have that fleshy material, that fleshy body. It's very much so a membrane animal. But based off of them watching other animals eat and watching how the ecosystem is kind of revolving around them, oysters would have been something that, you know, the very early people of this planet would have been very, very familiar with and actually had a real reliance on. Because, like I was saying, the oysters filter the water, and through them filtering the water, they're actually filtering the oxidized rocks or oxidized minerals that are around us. So that's all the iron, zinc, copper, silver, gold, every kind of natural metal that you can find inside of our rocks or inside of the mineral content of an environment will be represented inside of these oysters. And so they'll be giving you, especially for people from an early time period when there is no North Face jackets and no Timberland boots and no winter gear for you to be able to wear, and for all intents and purposes, no supermarket, you know, no place for you to be able to go and just kind of pick your food up. You know, you have to go out and hunt or gather your food yourself. This would have been a food source that's prepackaged that would have come with iron, zinc, copper, and magnesium, all of the things that you really need in order to survive through the colder times of the year, especially. It would have been high in protein and a highly digestible protein due to the fact that it is inside that membrane form. So everybody can digest it. And the only way for you to get a similar kind of nutrition naturally would have been through eating basically like a heart or a liver or drinking blood of another animal. And like I was saying, unless you're going out and hunting those animals yourself, especially inside of a tribe where you have to kind of protect the strongest people inside the tribe for the safety of everybody else, you know, those things would have been limited. Everything except for the blood would have been very limited in terms of access to the whole entirety of the tribe, the young people. Getting iron and zinc and magnesium-rich food, especially in a prepackaged form, which you can just kind of put in your, not in your pocket per se, but inside of some sort of a satchel or inside of some sort of a carrying device that you have. You know, oyster would have been something that everybody would have been able to pick up and have for themselves, especially in the early days when the oyster reefs were so prolific. And, you know, having an oyster that would have been full grown would have been about the size of a dinner plate in some places. And having an oyster that's that size that you can just kind of pull out and eat whenever that you want to, either throw it on the fire or create some sort of a device, a sharp device to be able to crack them open, it would have been extremely essential for everybody on the waterfront areas to be able to have access to that type of food. And, you know, these waterfront communities that we're talking about here, this is New York, this is Paris, this is pretty much anywhere that we have mega human civilizations or human cities to this day. You know, for 20,000 years, people would have been inside these areas because of the prolific oyster culture that would have been there, or shellfish culture that would have been there, and allowing them to be able to eat naturally and easily, as well as, you know, hunting and gathering other animals for resources like pelts and furs that would have been necessary to be able to clothe yourself during these time periods, during the colder time periods, the colder climate zones. But also, oysters would have created these kind of shell mounds, and the people from these areas would have kept these oyster shells, and they would have used them to kind of create a new water system by understanding the fact that what oysters need in order to really thrive and survive is more oyster shells. The oysters themselves, they don't reproduce like how we're familiar to reproducing. They reproduce more similar to like mushrooms or mycelium, in that they kind of spore. They kind of just spore egg and sperm into the waters, and those the millions and millions of these, you know, sperms and eggs would have met inside the water and fertilized each other in the water, and then became like similar to like little tadpoles. And once they became these little tadpoles, they'd be swimming around. And this is also something called zooplankton. And animals like whales, they really rely on plankton in order to feed themselves. They don't eat regular fish like how we would expect them to eat. They actually filter this this algae and this plankton in order to survive. So it would have been very, very rich inside of zooplankton at these oyster reef locations, and also creating, like I was saying, habitat and nursery for a lot of other animals. So if you ever look at crabs and lobsters, they have these really strong pincers. And those pincers are for the purpose of actually cracking into shellfish. That's why they can snap your finger off, because they can crack into these shells. And getting into those shellfish would have been something that, this would have been very, very necessary for those bottom feeder animals. And oysters aren't bottom feeders, they're filter feeders. So they don't necessarily have to be at the bottom of the ocean. They can be anywhere inside the ocean that they can survive, like I'll explain later in terms of the new farming practices that are used. But the oyster shells would have been able to be used to both create kind of structure how the water systems would have flowed, how the water would have approached onto the land, and also how the water would have retreated back into the sea. And in that would create all sorts of nurseries for fishing and farming purposes. And also, they would have been something that, in terms of keeping the shells, it would have had value, So people would actually keep these oyster shells at the community, at the locations where they were picked up, and they would keep them in mounds. They would keep them in mountains of shells, and those shells would be something that they could both use to fertilize the land in terms of the soil, but also just in terms of recreating and reestablishing the oyster reefs that they were depleting as they were eating them. These shells would have been very crucial also in terms of a first line of defense from the waves and from the rising and the lowering of tide inside these areas, where the people were very familiar and very much a part of, the ecosystem of those areas. So keeping shells at the waterfront would have been something that was a cultural thing for pretty much anybody who lived at those areas. Instead of just keeping the shells and walking away with them and dumping them wherever, they actually kept them at the waterfront and put them back inside of the ocean. And they would have used them they would have kept them very close to their habitats and very close to the ocean. And it was a big part of their culture. It was actually a place where you'll find that there was a lot of people that were buried inside of these mounds. In terms of a place of respect, these were highly respected areas. The mounds were locations where we've been able to find our earliest artifacts, our earliest human artifacts, Venus statues and things of that nature. Our most primitive artifacts, the most primitive statues and, real pieces of art that we've been able to find have been found inside of these oyster shells. And that's all the way from Japan to the Americas and, and so forth. So these are some examples of different things that people would have done with these oysters in terms of, utilizing the shells to kind of redesign and reformat the land around them for them to be able to create habitat that was livable for these communities. At the very top left corner, you can see some sort of ring formations. And those ring formations, like I was saying, those oyster rings that they would have used, and those were oyster mounds, they would have been used as a first line of defense against the waves and kind of protecting their communities from outside entities, whether it be animals or the water itself or the wind. It would have kind of created a little bit of a safety net by having these massive mountains of shells. If you look to the right of that, you can see a picture of an oyster mound. And like I was saying, these were burial locations, but also, as you can see, these were elevated areas where people were able to kind of recreate the land structure around them using the shells to both have fertile ground. So the calcium carbonate inside the shells is very, very useful for creating good fertilizer for your soil, and also in terms of being able to do what people were doing later on, which is creating landfill. So redesigning the landscape around them inside a great mass of these shells. This was something extremely valuable to have this much shell to be able to redesign the lands and make it flat lands and elevated lands where you could build your habitat. And obviously, some of the people who would have been responsible for the creation of these things would have been celebrated, and they would have been at the tops of these places. And in terms of communal structure, the tops of these places would have been places where the chieftains lived and were also buried, and regular people from the communities. This was a place where if you lived on that area, you would be buried on that area, and you'd be buried inside of these mounds and buried inside of these human constructs. And at the bottom left corner, you can see something that's actually a Floridian island. This is an island in Florida that was created, and the whole bottom of this island is created using oyster shells. And so this gave new hunting ground. This gave locations where you could go to in terms of setting yourself up from your fishing, and also farming grounds, areas where you could now utilize a piece of land to be able to farm different plants that you wanted to be able to have access to that would have grown and thrived well inside those areas. And, that being in the middle of the water would have been very useful in terms of having a low impact location where you don't have to kind of bring water to your plants. You don't have to bring anything to these plants. They would actually have access to them just by being inside the location that they're in. It's a very active, waterfront property. And this bottom right corner is just more example of oyster rings protecting civilizations that were built up inside those areas. So, as I was mentioning, oysters would have been very valuable, and shellfish would have been very valuable. One of the reasons why they were so valuable is because of what I was mentioning in terms of the land, but also in terms of being able to identify yourself and to be able to pay respects to your environment. The seashell was something that was, very much so an example of the area that you lived in. So inside of like the Indian Ocean, and in Africa and in the surrounding areas all the way to China, the cowrie shell was something that was used as a form of currency, and this currency was something that was respected based off of the beauty of the shell, but also because they were sometimes very rare, and they were identifiers of the regions that they came from. And so, in terms of these cultures that we're talking about, these people would have been very much so about being able to pay respect to their environment that they come from. And if you think about it, they would have been unique to where you're from. And so somebody seeing these things for the first time from other areas, or even from those areas, the more unique and rare that these shells are, there would have been very high value in terms of communities. And also feathers, and also in terms of being able to create beads and create decorative wear that kind of tells your story specifically. Another thing that people would have used as currency at the earliest time periods, besides shells and feathers, would have been pelts of animals. And we can just imagine how valuable somebody coming to you with a seal pelt in an area where there's no seals, and you can get your first waterproof jacket for all intents and purposes through these seal pelts, or somebody else who's bringing you, brown bear jacket, and you've never been able to access a brown bear because your environment only gives you elk or polar bears, and polar bears are terrifying, and you're not really trying to go fight a polar bear. But these brown bears are plentiful, while these black bears are plentiful, and so hunting a black bear as a tribe would have been much more attainable and able to give you the winter wares that you need to be able to survive easily without having to hunt hundreds of muskrats or beavers or fox or whatever other animals, minks that you would have needed to both hunt, catch, and then preserve, and then turn them into sew them together to create winter wear. So pelts were extremely important to the earliest civilizations in terms of just being able to survive through the seasons that would have been very, very hard for you to survive through without having some kind of gear on. Eventually, our currency became this gold, and then later on fiat currency. But initially, it would have been the shells. And in fact, the story is that Manhattan was purchased by the Dutch for this quahog shell. So that's actually clam shells, and the clamshells would have been known as something called wampum. And the wampum was how Native Americans would trade in terms of both beaded necklaces and in terms of coins. These were wampum shell, and it's indicative of the area. And so it's not that trading guns or trading pots and pans with the earlier civilization, the earlier settlers of this area wouldn't have had value. They would have had great value, but it wouldn't have shown the respect that was necessary to really create a trade. So, even though it sounds like not a big deal to trade the shell as a form of currency, it would sound like something silly, but it wasn't really about the shell. It was really about more having an understanding that this is how you pay respect to the people of the area, that they don't value the guns and the pots and pans in the same level as they would value the shells, because the shells show you that you're respecting where somebody comes from. So, oysters and the foundation of New York. So, in the 1500s, Giovanni Verrazzano would have been coming down the Hudson River and looking at this area and seeing these oyster reefs that were so plentiful. Like I said, they said the oyster reefs, the oysters at full maturity would have been about the size of a dinner plate, And these are gigantic oysters, and those oysters, like I was saying, they're providing habitat for lobsters and for shrimp, and habitat for smaller fish to come and have their nursery. Also, habitat for whales to come with their young and to live inside of a highly oxidated environment for these mammals who need air to be able to actually breathe. And they would have been observing these Lenape people who would have been around all of these sea animals, otters and muskrats, and all of these animals that would have been so plentiful inside of this New York City region that we don't even have a relationship with the water anymore because we don't think about it, even though we're surrounded by water. But the water would have been exactly the place where majority of economy would have been built, especially seeing as how the first settlers here would have been people who were living off of the water, and that was something that the Dutch people came here. They didn't come here building plantations, really. They came here initiating trade, and they came here utilizing materials and restructuring materials into, utilizing trade into product. There was actually a man named Ian Rodriguez, and he's respected as the first settler of New York. And all he did was get off of the ship when they got here and take some pots and pans, and he was doing trade by basically just cooking food inside of pots and pans from his culture, from the Dominican Republic, utilizing the food that was accessible here, and he was able to, carve out a life for himself here with the native people, the Lenape, and he was like one of the first. He was like the first settler. It was the first settlement was this guy Juan Rodriguez, and basically, after that, the Dutch came and they really set up this community of oystermen and whalers and stoneware makers and trappers. And that was a huge portion of how they were able to initiate settling New York and creating the foundations of the city was through relations with the native people in this area, teaching them how to trap animals, trap fur, collect where to collect oysters, where and how to hunt whales. And these native people would have been hunting whales utilizing canoes, not utilizing these giant warships or giant sea ships, seafaring ships. They would have just been doing it with a crew of people on a canoe, understanding the different patterns that the whales take, and utilizing that to get this resource that would have given them blubber and and fish meat that could help their whole entire community to survive. So the Dutch actually were very, very important in terms of teaching Americas how to create civilization in general. The Dutch had a system that was very different than pretty much any other European country that came here initially. And that was something called the Dutch Indian Trading Company. And the Dutch East Indian Trading Company actually would have been the first time that somebody could have made an investment into a ship that would have came over here and get a return on investment. So we're talking about the creation of the stock market, and in terms of creating our stock market, everybody else was, it would have been the flag of the country. It would have been basically, the monarchies that came over here that would have been able to form, to have the structure to be able to get a return on their investment. But the Dutch, individuals, wealthy individuals who invested in these ships could send over people and send over resources and, expect that there would be a return on investment through basically the work of the people that were here. A lot of the people that they were involved with, their indentured servitude, if you will, was Dutch people, but also actually a lot of African Americans. Dutch were very much so a part of the slave trade, but the Dutch had a little bit of a different structure in what they, how they used slavery, and that they definitely had a lot of people who were enslaved by them and who were indentured to them actually be able to purchase their freedom from work. And like I was saying, in the other areas, the Virginias and Massachusetts areas, plantations and things of that would have been a very common thing. But inside of the Dutch areas, they were actually utilizing skilled labor. And so upon people learning different industry, they would have been able to earn money on their own and purchase their freedom and have a skill set so that they're not, basically reliant on society once being free, not being somebody who's learning some skill off of a plantation that's not really applicable. These people would have learned different skill sets that, maritime skill sets such as sail making or stoneware making and oystering and blubber. The blubber from these whales would have been used to create the original oil. That's how you lit up a town, was through whale blubber. And so there were a lot of skilled laborers that would have left from these Dutch communities and been able to go and find work after, buying their freedom. So the oysters and the foundation of New York, there were several African American families that were actually released and freed by the Dutch above the Wall Street. So basically, Wall Street, when the British took control of Manhattan, was already kind of a place where there was both a need for the wall to be there because of the Dutch having issues with, the Lenape and other Native American tribes coming in through the northern portion of the island, but also would have been trading points, and so that Wall Street area is actually later on going to be known as the Mill Market. And previous to that, there was actually a bunch of African American families who were leased above the wall. And really what they were doing was kind of initiating kind of relations with the Native American people of that area and kind of carving out what would become later on settlement areas based off of them being carved out. This is a very common practice and happened all the way through the northern areas. And in fact, a lot of the Pinkster celebration would have been held between both enslaved African Americans and people who were freed African Americans. And it would have been, a good way for everybody to kind of come together during those time periods. Basically, New York City after the Dutch, was very, very highly slave trade through the British rule, and a lot of what they had learned from the Dutch was the creation of something called the East Indian Trading Company, which is where people could make investments from the British side now and get back a return on investment through trade here inside of through the Americas. And Manhattan would have been one of those places where this foundation of a stock market really was being created. And the stock market is what we know of today as the World Trade System. And that really started here inside of New York and in Philadelphia. But New York, we really, for all intents and purposes, we are the capital of the stock market in terms of the World Trade System. And that was all started off by the Dutch. And in terms of that time period, these trades would have happened inside of these bars. And the bars would have been owned very frequently by free Black people. Now, Black people had a situation where they could be freed. Hold on one second. Where they could be freed, and based off of their papers, having papers was the way how they'd be able to, hold on to their freedom. And it really required them having those papers and those papers being intact and somebody not destroying those papers and not having a backup plan in terms of being identified as, a way to keep their freedom. And so a lot of African Americans that were freed, they would work on ships. That was something that, that was a way for them to have a community of people who knew who they were, who could vouch for them. And another thing that was very common in terms of the Dutch was through the bars, the taverns. The tavern actually, in Dutch culture, represented the town hall. It represented the notary. So, if you wanted to do a trade with somebody, you needed to be able to have a person kind of be a middleman, somebody who could be like, you could say to them, like, you see this trade happening between two of us. I bought this cow, so don't let this person come back and say I didn't buy it because I bought it. You see that I'm buying it, right? So that the bartender would have been very valuable in terms of initiating trades. And also, if you guys had a piece of mail sent to you, there was no post office. So the post office would have been the bar. And, the tavern would have also been a hotel. It would have been where you slept at night. And the tavern would have also been a place for, uh, you know, uh, for lack of a better word, like prostitution would have happened inside of these places. And these bars were called dive bars because you would dive into the cellar of these bars, and that's where you would go to drink, and then you could come upstairs and then get a place to sleep for the night. And so a lot of Manhattan during this time period, during the early foundations of Manhattan, was dive bars or these like seedy kind of taverns where trade was happening. All of the trade was happening on the street. There was no town hall per se or actual trade buildings as of this point. Majority of the trade of whale blubbers and bottled oysters and everything from rice and grain to oysters and pelts and stoneware. This was happening inside of these bars and at these taverns where people were able to kind of create relationships through these bar owners to know, where to get things from in the first place. Some examples of uh, bar owners is my hero, one of my heroes, Thomas Downing. And Thomas Downing was somebody who was born a freed slave, and he was born in Virginia, but he traveled up to Pennsylvania and then came to New York. And he started out oystering, just like picking oysters out of the water. So the way how oysters used to be picked up was you basically tonged them out of the water, and then there would be these oyster carts, and then these oyster bars eventually, if they had earned enough to be able to build out one of these bars, these oyster bars, these oyster taverns. And Thomas Downing was somebody who had come from an area where there was affluence, and being born, a freed person, he had seen, elegant life, people who had lived a little bit above the means of a lot of people who New Yorkers had relationships with. And so he understood that, both uh, the fact that his uh, family was, they ran a church. And so, governors and people with power and people who were in elite positions who needed to buy this whale blubber and who needed to initiate, these trades for their whole entire towns, they would need to have a little bit more of a pulled up environment to be able to live and to come stay inside of these taverns rather than doing it at these red light districts, at these, seedier places. So he made actually the first fine dining, well, one of the first fine dining institutions here, which was his oyster bar, Thomas Downing's Oyster House. And he would get, stoneware from people like this guy, Thomas Camera, who was another African American who was a freed person who had learned stoneware trade from his previous owners. And he was able to create basically like an oyster factory or, oyster service, like a ability to sell oysters bottled and a restaurant to be able to sell the oysters at, where the rich elite could come and do the same thing as initiating the trades that they were doing inside the lower end places, but this time with a little bit more class and elegance. And he's credited as being somebody who was a very, very wealthy person during this time period. So, like I was saying, oysters were very plentiful at the harbors of the city during this time period. This was a common man's food. So, as you can see in the top picture here, somebody with just some tongs could go into the water and be able to pull up oysters and be able to sell them from these carts. And these oyster carts were very, very important. And also whaling. Whaling was a huge thing. And so anybody who was able to catch these whales was able to create this blubber. And people who had familiarity with maritime culture, which is a lot of freed African Americans during this time period, they would be able to thrive inside of those environments and those industries. And it was something that was very crucial for Black people from the 1700s on up until about the 1860s. It was something that it created towns and a whole entire civilization, such as the sandy grounds in Staten Island. These were oystering communities, African American oystering communities of people who were very wealthy through this oystering practice and whaling practice. So yes, as I was explaining, there were oyster carts that were plentiful, and so Thomas Downing, started off. He had actually in the War of 1812 left from Virginia, went to Philadelphia, and basically, he was very much so a part of creating these this fine dining culture. But he started off with this cart on the sidewalk, somewhere like basically the same thing as me. He was selling oysters for a penny on the street, and then elevated it into all of these cooked dishes like oyster stuffed turkeys and oyster stews and terrapin stews and things of that nature that were delicacies of his time period. And 1792 was when he was born, but the New York Stock Exchange was still pretty much not centralized until he was an adult and he was creating these fine dining establishments. And in fact, the location where our stock exchange exists now at Broad Street was the location of his oyster bar. It is to this day the location where his oyster bar used to be in the 1820s. 1825, he opened his first oyster bar and became one of New York City's wealthiest men. This bottom right picture is an example of his family. So this is his son, George Thomas Downing, and this is his family around him. You can see they were very, very, well-to-do and an affluent family. They started out George Thomas started out in New York, but he left soon after his father's passing away in 1866. So factories killed the oyster star. So as I was saying, hold on one second, please. As I was saying, Thomas Downing, he passed away in 1866. So this is literally 1 year after the end of the Civil War. And during that time period, oysters were still plentiful, and a few things happened. We had the draft riots of Manhattan, where a lot of these wealthy African American churches and African American schools and just influential African Americans that were freed during this time period became under fire from the communities based off of the fact that people were not happy with the end of the Civil War. But the Civil War also drove in the war machines. So there was a lot of technology that came in after the Civil War, the end of the Civil War. And one of those things was steamboats. So previous to that, individuals with just a little boat would have been able to go out and collect these oyster shells. But after the steamboat came, a lot of the maritime industry changed forever, in that now we could do something called dredging. And so dredging is when you basically just drag a net across the bottom of the ocean floor and pull up everything. And you didn't need wind to be able to do this now with these steamboats. Steam-powered energy, you could just basically tear up the entirety of these oyster reefs. And something that was happening during this industrial revolution was canneries. And you could now can these oysters and can all of this shellfish and all of the fish in general and sell them to hungry people for very low prices. And so, as well as the oystering industry being changed forever at this time period, now there was a lot of manufacturing and factory style that was happening at this time period. And we're talking everything from ironwork to major clothing production to, basically every industry of painting and things of this nature, paints and anything that was necessary for the growth of economy in a massive scale no longer had to be done by the individual. Manufacturing of cotton and manufacturing of leather goods and basically anything that was being manufactured was being manufactured in factories, and there was no laws on the dumping of these of the refuse of the runoff from these companies. There was no laws put on these companies. So Manhattan turned into this gigantic factory, basically, where everybody was kind of living to work at these factories. If you could get a job inside the factories, you could be employed. You no longer could be employed by the maritime industry anymore. And, basically anybody who previously was eating from the water was not able to eat off of the water anymore, because now the ocean floor was depleted completely, and anything that was living inside the ocean was going to be filter feeding all of these toxins, all this bad material that was just being dumped inside the ocean willy-nilly at the time period. And so, during the 1920s, when our Great Depression happened, people who used to be able to eat oysters for a penny on the street, they wouldn't have been able to do that anymore. They would have had to, they would have had to find other food supplies, because it was very dangerous to eat from the ocean at this time period or eat from the river at this time period, because there was mass pollution. There was just pollution, and no rains being put on it. And so from about the, 1860s to about 1969, or actually 1972, 1970s, there was no laws put on this dumping. The dumping went on for a really long time. And in the 1970s, we created something called the Clean Water Act, which was to, kind of put some regulations on these companies for the first time and tell people you can't just dump whatever that you guys want into the ocean. It's destroying everything. And so we need to put some regulations on this, and making companies that were now mega companies responsible for how they got rid of their toxic waste. And in the 1960s and 70s also, there became organizations like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and they began to do this process of keeping the oyster shells and repurposing the oyster shells for the intention of rebuilding oyster beds, because of the need for oyster beds, because of the importance of oyster reefs to the waterfront area and to maritime culture in general. And this is another initiative that has been picked up inside of New York, specifically by one organization that I really like called the Billion Oyster Project, and another organization called Escape. And this is to protect our waterfronts from the potential $50 billion in damage that we'll have inside the next 50 years, based off of the climate and the ocean levels rising, but also to rebuild our natural ecosystem. And there were so many oysters inside of our ocean, inside of our Hudson River at one time period, that they would basically filter the water clean every 72 hours. They basically changed the waterfront every 72 hours based off of how much that they were filtering the water. We're trying to get some of that back now. So this is a bit of oyster anatomy. Oysters are very simple. They don't have brains, but they do have hearts and stomachs, and they're, like I was saying, they're filter feeders. do, eat and uh, they eat and poop just like anybody else, but they're very basic in terms of their design. They're pretty much an abductor muscle and gills that work really hard to eat, and then also they reproduce, and that's basically it. They're just filtering water, eating it, and then reproducing inside of the warmer months. During time periods when the water goes below 40 degrees, they're really thriving. And I mean, it rises above 40 degrees, they're really thriving and creating, that effect that I was talking about in terms of filtering the water. And in terms of the food source, they're a very, very basic food source. They're one of the earlier food sources in terms of them having that membrane design, in terms of the body being really delicate and being a form of protein that's highly digestible for anybody and everybody. So, this is not like it's more digestible than a chicken breast or, a piece of fish even. This is protein that goes basically directly into our systems, and it's very, very simple food for us to be able to digest. But like I was saying, oysters spawn by the million, and basically they're eating the oxidized mineral inside the area. So it's iron, zinc, copper, magnesium. That's what they're ingesting, and obviously the different plankton and algae from that area also. And so this is what affects the taste of an oyster. So if you go to get an oyster from the Pacific Ocean, it'll taste a lot different than the oyster from the Atlantic Ocean based off of what's readily available inside the water. And also if you taste an oyster from Louisiana versus an oyster from Nova Scotia or Prince Edward Island or New York, they're going to taste very different based off of what's present inside of the water in those areas. So this is a kind of an example of the life cycle of an oyster. So if you see inside the bottom left corner, you see the first example of like eggs and sperm. And once those eggs fertilize by a sperm, they're turned into basically like these little tadpoles and little larvae, and those begin to swim around in the water, filtering the water themselves and ingesting foods that will be inside the water surface and at the top level of the ocean. And then as they're swimming around and being zooplankton, they'll begin to gain a little bit of weight from eating. And once they gain more weight, and that membrane begins to get a little bit more solidified in terms of turning into a shell, they'll start to sink. And what they should find in nature would be oyster shell. And if they found oyster shell, or at the very least a hard surface, then they'd be able to reproduce by the million. And oysters are so prolific, in fact, that they're asexual. So there'd be so many oysters if we had oyster reefs that oysters themselves could cull themselves or just decide to become male or female based off of the need represented inside the area, represented in the water of either eggs to sperm ratios. So these reefs would have been able to basically communicate with each other and create the reproductive needs to be able to make their reefs thrive. So these are some examples of how oysters are grown. If you look at the left corner there, you can see some guy that he's got a little kayak or a little boat, and he's going through and flipping over these bags. And those bags have like little pool noodles, so it's basically like little nets, and those are holding up these little mesh bags, and the pool noodles are keeping these mesh bags afloat. And inside of those bags would be oyster seed. So baby, teeny tiny little oysters would be growing inside of there. And based off of them growing inside of those bags, they're actually not connected to each other like the previous picture. They're actually growing individually. So they have a little bit of real estate they're fighting against the tide. So their abductor muscles, which is what's really keeping them closed, would have been getting a lot more exercise and a lot stronger, giving them a better texture. And that's basically a scallop. The abductor muscle is basically a scallop. That's what a scallop is. It's just the abductor muscle that keeps the thing closed. And so them living off the top of the water, they'll be getting sunlight. They'll be eating a lot more algae and plankton, and they'll be getting exercise, and they won't be stuck together, which is very important. And those abductors will be very strong, which is also very important in terms of creating a high product oyster. On the right side, you can see kind of these oyster cages, and these oysters are examples of oysters that will be getting put back inside the ocean, but they're growing more inside of like the reef structure, where they're just kind of connected to each other and not really giving you that same body. They're going to be eating more from the water that's at the bottom of the ocean, and those are your quote unquote wild caught oysters. But we don't have any wild caught oysters really at all. Wild caught oysters is just a terminology in terms of explaining how they're grown. All oysters that we eat are basically farmed, and so they're added to the environment and put in the waters. And based off of them being put inside the water, now somebody can sell them as a company to the public. But there is no collecting oysters from oyster reefs that's really happening, except for in very rare occasions where you can get licenses to do so. But the oysters that we get from oyster bars and from supermarkets and from restaurants and farmers markets, those are all farmed. All oysters that we get are farmed. So these are some examples of how creative that oyster farming can be. The oyster can be farmed all the way to the middle of the ocean. We don't even need to rely on the waterfront areas to be able to do this well. If we can build out docks inside the middle of the ocean, we can basically farm oysters all the way at the middle of the ocean and create food supply for the entire public. And oysters, seaweed, mushrooms, and insects. These are the only foods that we have access to that we can farm without creating an impact on the environment that's negative. These are animals and fruit and plants that we can farm, and their whole entirety of what they need is inside of the environment already. We don't add anything to the environment. We don't feed these things. We just put them inside of their natural environment and let them thrive. Beehives and oyster farms and, for the most part, mushroom growth and seaweed growth. They're reliant on their environment. Mushrooms being a sterile environment, but with the seaweed and with the oysters, it's less about creating a sterile environment that has like need for light and stuff like that. Even you're just putting them inside their natural habitat and letting them thrive. So this is an example of what Scape is doing. So as I was saying, rebuilding oyster reefs both will do a positive effect for the fish and for the wildlife inside the area, but also for the boating and for the houses that is inside those areas as well. Waterfront property is at major risk right now based off of the fact that the erosion of the sea line will be doing a massive amount of damage to these properties at these areas. Our major cities are all on water, like I was saying, and they run the risk of having real damage happen to them if there's no first line of defense, as we've seen with these different hurricanes and floods that we've been experiencing. If without the oyster reefs being there as a natural first line of defense, not only do we not have the small fish that we basically hunted into extinction, and all of our fish is basically farmed now too, which is not sustainable, but also, protecting the waterfront itself is necessary just to have oyster reefs there. And so the projection is not to have these oysters that we're utilizing through the Billion Oyster Project or through SCAPE as consumable oysters ever. It's more so about having these oysters be inside the environment for the sake of oyster reefs themselves and the sake of the wildlife and the sake of the environment and the ocean itself. Oyster farmers have unlimited access. Our planet's 70% water, so there's no need ever for these reefs that are being reconstructed to be utilized for food source, more so just for the sake of protecting our environment and protecting our homes. And like I was saying before, the lobsters and the crabs, they rely on these shellfish in order to eat. And the real reason why Maine is able to be basically the lobstering capital of the world to this day is based off of their prolific shellfish culture. They have tons and tons of oyster farmers there who do not pull their oysters for the sake of selling them to the mass public in the same structure of what we do. They keep those oysters up there, and those shellfish pockets, that's where the oyster farmers, using their technology that we have today, you see as hotspots for placing their cages. And they have a lot of rules and regulations in terms of how they're able to collect these lobsters. But it's so prolific up there. There is hundreds of people basically lobstering out there, and able to do so successfully because of the fact that the shellfish culture there is so prolific still to this day. These are more examples of how far-reaching and how just sprawling that we can create an oyster farming culture. And if people just ate 10% more oysters, think about the reduction on cow and pig and fish and other foods that we really rely on. That's not a sustainable food source. And the fact that there are countries and places where people really need to have nutrient-rich proteins that could benefit from having oysters being farmed, and just how much the common person that doesn't eat oysters, their life could be changed by having access to something that's both delicious, really truly delicious, whether it be baked or whether it be smoked or whether it's just raw. It's a really good food source in terms of nutrition. People call oysters an aphrodisiac. That's based off of the iron, zinc, copper, and magnesium that's in them in the digestible hemo form. And, having people having the need for oyster farms is really what we have. And having people understand that that's something that it's helpful to the environment. These are whole entire oyster reefs basically that are being created here. And this is our beautiful coastline, and all of this area is oyster culture. All this is oyster region, all the way down to Florida's where we have our coral reefs. This is all viable oyster culture, all the way up into the Canadas where my favorite oysters come from, and below and all around. We really need to try to think about how much of an impact, a positive impact that our nature would have by having oyster reefs for non-consumption and oyster farms for consumption, just kind of creating new ecosystems for all of us and the most important states inside of the East Coast, all of this could be affected positively by having a prolific oyster culture again. I'm trying to get people to like oysters to the point where Popeyes is trying to copy me and get people having oyster sandwiches. And this is the Billion Oyster Project. And they have a school on Governor's Island where they're teaching kids about marine biology. Oyster farmers are actually really doing a really great thing in the fact that, they have to test the water. They have to test the water for their product on a regular basis. So they're pretty much they're pretty much doing marine biology, and they're the ones that are really kind of responsible for telling our government to some extent what the waters are doing. because that's what they're responsible for in terms of the product that they sell. And a lot of kids, especially coming up in New York, they're so far removed from the water. Majority of people are terrified of the water and don't have any relationship with it. The Only Oyster Project is giving kids pathways into scuba diving and to boat captaining and marine biology and oyster farming, and even down to what I do is restaurateuring, with the understanding that this is a kind of a guilt-free industry, something that we can kind of be proud of and stand behind and be proud of ourselves for selling, rather than feeling, guilty for selling chicken or for selling beef or selling something that ultimately, we're both worried about the impact on the animals, but also the impact on the environment and, the health of the people who eat the food. This is an example of a flourishing oyster reef. You can see the diversity of plants and different other organisms that are clearly thriving and flourishing here. And this mountain of oyster shells should be all the way across all of that coastline that you just now saw, creating biodiversity and protecting our waterfront properties, but also purifying the water and giving us, oxygen-rich environment, and reducing our carbon footprint for everybody. And that's me. Yeah. That's it. That's my presentation, guys.
All right. Thank you so much, Moody. That was super interesting. I definitely learned a lot about oysters. I'm originally from the middle of the country, so not a lot of ocean where I was growing up. So it was super great to learn all of that. If folks are watching live, you can go ahead and drop your questions in the chat. But in the meantime, Moody, I am going to ask you a question that I hope you can answer for me, because I have never had an oyster. I'm a little afraid of shellfish in general. But what would you consider the best gateway dish for people to get familiar with oysters if they're a little worried about eating maybe raw oysters?
I think, so I ate oysters in Louisiana and in Florida at first. And in Louisiana and in Florida, there's baked oysters and fried oysters. And I think that those oysters in Louisiana and Florida specifically, due to, like I was saying, the mineral content of the waters that's down there, the oysters themselves bland and naked are kind of a little bit bland. I didn't like oysters for a really long time because I thought that they were all going to be just like these big meaty oysters that I had in Louisiana. I didn't have much flavor profile to them, and they weren't good to me. I thought they were kind of gross. But in terms of eating, oysters raw, my mind completely got changed the first time that I got an oyster from British Columbia and an oyster from Nova Scotia. And those oysters, oh my gosh, you want to eat a raw. Do not cook those oysters. Eat those oysters raw because you're going to miss out, And also go for a cocktail-sized oysters for the raw oysters. And for cooked oysters, you go for the larger size oysters because you just have more, A great thing that I do with oysters at my shop, I do these oyster rich boys. So basically, I take a whole bunch of oysters and put them into these molds. And we deep fry the molds. And so you get like a whole entire oyster patty, and put it out on a sandwich. Oyster flavor is incredible. So like people use oysters for like oyster sauces inside of Asian countries because oysters themselves, like if you enjoy a seafood flavor, the oyster gives a super rich umami flavor of the sea, And in terms of, like oyster chowder, I make oyster chowder out of them. I use them for gumbos, in terms of adding to like a seafood boil or anything really where there's like seafood flavor that you're looking for. The oyster is a super additive to all of those dishes because of how, strong and how rich of a flavor that they are. And also, like I was saying, iron, zinc, copper, magnesium is all present inside of these animals, inside of a great form, not inside of the shrimp, not inside of the fish, not inside of anything really except for the shellfish. It's going to be way more prevalent.
I just had to point out, because I don't know if everybody caught it, that you said oyster rich boy instead of an oyster po' boy, right? I love that.
Yeah, nah. We ain't doing that. We're speaking words and life and stuff. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, it looks like, oh, we do have a question. Okay. This is from Carmen, who says, Hi, Moody. I met you at the Pinkster celebration on Sunday. You mentioned the Black Schuyler family as
Woo.
owners and operators of sloops. I was wondering if you had heard of the Black Johnson family.
Nope, I have not, and I did need to talk more about the sloops. The sloops was another way for African Americans to really get work for themselves on the water. These were small ships that would have been able to transport both people and actual like products all the way from Albany down to New York. And previous to the steamboat, like I was saying, this that was really the only way for people to make this trip happen reasonably a time frame was to get on one of these small ships. And there was a lot of African Americans who were involved inside of the slooping industry. But the most well known from like the Hudson and Albany areas was the Schuyler family. And they even got into the steamboating industry after the Civil War. And it's really interesting to know how many wealthy black captains of whaling ships, people inside of sail making industry, hotel industry that there were during this time period when we don't think about African Americans being influential due to slavery. But regardless of slavery, African Americans have been an essential portion of the American economy in terms of doing work, doing the hard work that has created what has been the pathways for all industries the entire time. We've been here the whole time. I'm actually in this really cool documentary on Netflix called High on the Hog, and it talks about like the impact that African Americans had on the culinary industry. I'm on episode number 3, Carmen. But it's
I
also
love
about
that documentary.
the
It's
fact
great.
it was so good. It's so good. And I couldn't think of a better way to be able to get my little 15 minutes on TV type of a deal rather than some cooking show where I got to battle against, Hell's Kitchen and stuff like that. I didn't have to do none of that. I was like on High on the Hog, yo, talking about Black history. You know what I'm saying? Making Black history. So yeah, that was cool.
Yeah, so
And
Carmen,
thank you,
you'll
Carmen, for
have to
both joining us. And
tell us more about the Black Johnsons if you know more about them. Oh yeah, she says
yeah, I
if
don't
you'd
know
be
about the
interested
Black
in the
Shark.
Johnsons, she'd be happy to share. So yes, I think Moody and I would both be interested to hear more about that family. Great. Okay. Well, we've gone over time, which is fine by me, but I do want to keep it a little bit short. So if anybody has any other questions, you can go ahead and email us, phillipsmanorhall@parks.ny.gov. We'll forward them along to Moody. And of course, if you are in Brooklyn, you can make sure to stop by the Real Mother Shuckers Oyster Cart and say hello and get a taste of oysters. So thanks again, Moody, for
We're
joining us.
actually at Pier 57.
Woo,
Pier
okay.
57, 16th Street, 11th Avenue. Yeah.
Great. Thank
7
you so
days a
much.
week.
All right,
Thank
so
you guys.
Moody rounds out our lecture series for the summer. We will return again in September. Meantime, you can see all of our upcoming events at phillipsmanorhall.com. Thanks again, Moody. Great to see you as always, and we'll see everybody next time. Have a good night.